Leather and shadow cut through elvish light, as a stranger from a darker world stood in Imladris and taught men, hobbits, and elves how to become a single, deadly mind. He wore no heraldry, only a ragged cloak that drank the gold from the afternoon where his hood fell back. His face was set in lines of long practice and quiet hunger. Elves paused in their weaving of light and song, men straightened beneath their own shame and hope. Hobbits laughed once, at first, until his eye, a small, strange thing that missed nothing, rested on them, and the laughter fell away. The valley smelled of rain and old books. Courtyards echoed with boot and hoof and the soft, unhurried clack of elven speech. Yet the stranger moved as though not bound to seasons nor to song. His steps were measured, and where he placed a foot the dew lay untroubled. They called him many things in whispers, a hunter, a warrior, a madman. Elrond's house welcomed him still, for hospitality was a net that even the wary could not deny. He answered no question of origin. He gave what he had, and he demanded only attention. He taught first what all men and elves thought they already possessed, to see. He would stand in the hall at dusk and say nothing, and they would watch him as one might watch a bird. Then he would vanish like smoke through a keyhole and return to tap 3 cups on a table or to pluck a single white thread from a tapestry without disturbing another. Frodo, who had been trained in carefulness by his own small life, found that his breath stilled like an animal's when the stranger passed near. Aragorn, who had long walked dark places, felt the cool bite of comparison at his throat. Legolas' eyes widened, then sharpened. Gimli swore softly that no dwarf had ever been so unseen, and yet he admired the craft. The stranger taught the fellowship to read a trail as a bard reads a song. He knelt in mud and fingered impressions with gloved hands, then closed his eyes and told stories of a single boot step, the angle of a heel, the bruise where a new tread had slipped. Sam listened as if learning to read. At last he learned the difference between a hurried step and one that had paused to look upon the flowers. Merry and Pippin learned too, though they chafed at the discipline. Boromir's jaw grew heavy as he watched. He heard in the lesson the promise of swifter victory. Gandalf watched him watch, and a shadow passed over the gray wizard's face like a cloud. The stranger's cunning was not only in his sight, but in the small instruments he made of the world. He took things that men and elves used without thought, rope, scrap iron, the quiet of a winter gutter, and showed how each could be bent to concealment or to sudden revelation. He would toss a small stone that bloomed in the air like a black flower and shroud a column in smoke, and from that shadow 2 small blades would gleam. He never taught them the need to kill at once. He taught them the need to end a threat swiftly. Yet the motions he taught were clean and efficient and left little room for mercy if mercy delayed the blow. Discipline came next, and it came hard. Mornings began before the dawn unrolled the last of its stars. Hobbits cursed more than once, for Hobbit morning is a festival usually, but they came all the same. The stranger made them stand until the muscles sang, and the lungs begged he made them run until the hills around Imladris counted them as one of their own. He taught them to sleep with one eye open, to sleep by turns, to prepare a camp that was a trap as much as shelter. He taught meditation like a weapon. The silence between heartbeats could be used to steady a hand and to plan 10 moves ahead. There was a curious order to his harshness. He punished sloth, but rewarded thought. He praised Sam when the gardener used a simple fork to fashion a snare that could entangle a man without breaking bone. He nodded to Frodo when the little hobbit chose to spare a captured scout who had blood on his hands, acknowledging the choice, but pressing him with questions like a smith asking if his iron was quenched enough. Aragorn and Legolas sparred beneath an old elm until the leaves were shed and their arms ached. Gimli forged weights and called them honors. Boromir threw himself into the drills as though by sweating he might burn away the doubts that sat behind his eyes. Yet every new skill cut away a part of what they had been. Where once they paused over enemy faces to read sorrow and fear, now they dissected intent like a surgeon, faster and more efficient, but colder. Merry noticed on a night patrol that his laughter had grown thin. Pippin began to plan his jokes so they would land like small, precise bars of iron. Frodo found himself listening for the rhythm of another man's, breathing and finding ways to still it that his old self would have recoiled from knowing. Sam woke one night and found his hand on a stick, ready to strike an imagined threat. He wept a small, bitter tear at his pillow and wrapped his arms around it and did not admit to the sting. Gandalf spoke to the stranger once by the river, words low and careful, like a man plucking a harp. "You teach skill," the wizard said, "yet there are hearts that must remain soft, else they break." The stranger listened and tilted his head, as one studies a torn map. He answered with a story instead of a dogma, of a shadow that had swallowed a village because it had lost the shape of mercy, of a sword that struck true but left a land colder for it. The tale was short and had no name, only the weight of proof. Gandalf's thumb ran along his staff. He did not forbid what the stranger offered, but he also did not bless it. There were tests, staged like plays with new stakes. An ambush in the orchard taught them how to move like wind and glass. A mock betrayal in the dining hall taught them to guard against familiar faces, turning knife. Boromir failed one test with a brutal efficiency that startled even himself. He broke a mock, assassin's arm to stop a blow, and then sat stunned by his own merciless hand. Aragorn steadied him and did not scold. He placed a palm upon the other's shoulder and said that strength must be an answer, not an excuse. Boromir listened, and a cold pride grew in him like an iron seed. Legolas adapted fastest. There was a fluency in his limbs that made the stranger smile once, a smile like a blade's flash. Gimli resisted with stubborn craft, and yet he learned to move his weight so that a swing became a whisper instead of a shout. Frodo surprised them all by his steadiness in the art of listening, and deducing his small fear became a careful compass. Sam's hands remained the gentlest, and that gentleness found use in healing as well as in trapping. Merry and Pippin, who could not resist the lure of mischief, turned that mischief into cunning and became in their way small but deadly puzzles set upon a path. The stranger taught rules written not upon paper but into the daily rhythm of their bodies. He spoke of a code, not lofty phrases about honor, but hard, narrow things. Prepare always, strike only what you must, learn every path of flight and retreat, guard your heart so that it may judge. He pressed a hand into Frodo's palm and told him, in a voice like gravel underfoot, that rules are the bones of a life walked long. They will hold you fast, he said, but they will also bind you if you do not remember why you made them. Frodo felt the truth of that in his chest and did not say which he feared more, the binding or the breaking. Rumor flowed faster than a mountain brook. News of the stranger's methods spread to the borders of the house, and with it came the leaning of choices. Some among them embraced the edge he sharpened, for they saw in it the capacity to keep more lives than it might take. Others recoiled, fearful that the sharpening would sever compassion. Gandalf, who had seen many sorts of darkness, did not stop them. He walked the halls at night and counseled in soft words, teaching that wisdom was to choose when to use the taut blade and when to lay it down. Near the close of his first full week, the stranger took them to the high veranda where the valley opened and the sunlight fell like a veil. He set a single black cloak upon a stone and then turned to the fellowship, standing in a loose ring. He did not remind them of the world they would soon walk into. Such reminders were needless. Instead, he asked one question, a keen, simple challenge. "When you go," he said, "will you be hunters of victory or keepers of mercy?" He let the silence hang between them like a net. They answered in small ways. Frodo put his hand upon his cloak and did not say which path he chose. Aragorn lifted his chin and gave a long, steady look that was not all resolve, but much practice. Boromir's fingers curled once around the bolster of the railing until his knuckles shone. Gandalf watched them all and smiled a thin, knowing smile that was more weary than pleased. The stranger folded his hands and watched, too, as a trainer awaits whether his crafted blade can be wielded with conscience. They would leave Imladris soon, for the roads of the world will not wait for moral instruction to finish its course. But before they left, before their steps turned away from the silver of the valley, they took up new ways of being in the world. They had been forged into a sharper shape. The question that now lingered in the hush of the veranda and in the quiet breaths between men and hobbit and elf was not whether they were stronger. That was plain. The question was which of them would keep the light within their hands and which would keep only the dark that made light more effective. As twilight drew a blue net over the ravine, the stranger turned once toward the shadowed road that led east. He did not speak of banners nor of doom. He only lifted his hood slightly, as if adjusting some unseen weight, and walked toward a path they all felt already tugging them forward. Behind him, the fellowship gathered their cloaks and their doubts. Their feet made decisions upon the stones, and those decisions moved like the first step of a long march. The lamps in Imladris burned low beneath the high arch of stone and leaf. Their light fell in long, quiet pools upon the water, and the air tasted of cold iron and old leaves. A hush lay on the house that was more watch than sleep. Even the sound of footsteps seemed measured, as if afraid to wake something beneath the rafters. At the edge of the court, a figure moved like a shadow cut from darker cloth, a cape drawn close, a cowl half seen in the lamplight. He taught as he had taught before, hands that showed no cruelty, only law movements given in small, exacted demonstrations, as if he wrought order from muscle and breath. They practiced in silence. Blows were struck where they would not mar the stone, strands of rope were loosed and drawn, and the hobbits learned to thread themselves between the legs of an elder like mice between roots. The elf watched with eyes like pale rain, the dwarf ground his teeth and kept trying. The ranger set his jaw and listened to every direction the stranger offered. When the lesson turned to stillness, the stranger spoke seldom, and the words he chose were few, coolly cut to fit the needs of each listener. "Breathe," he said once, and the sound of that single command steadied 10 hearts. It happened, as such things often do in lands that keep long memories, that the world answered the training with a portent. A wind came down from the north like a thought with no author. It first moved the banners in the gallery, then the hair on the nape of every neck present. It did not smell of frost or of pine, but of iron and old grief. From the valley below there rose a low keening, far and thin, that set the lamplight to quivering. Even those who had no eye for augury felt the change as a pressure upon the chest, as if some unseen presence had leaned against the borders of the house and listened. The stranger's hand went once, silent, to the place at his hip where a cloak and rope were kept. He did not look surprised. "They test the walls first," he said, voice flat as flint. They send their whisperers to learn whether a house will wake and strike. That we hear them is a good thing. It gives us choice." "Choice," said the ranger with a slow breathing. He stepped forward, and the moon gilded his dark hair. "We will not be surprised," he answered. There was a steadiness in him born of hard roads. "We will meet what comes with eyes open." They split as the stranger had arranged into small hands, each given a silent purpose. The elf went to the high branches that overhung the terraces and became one with the leaves. The dwarf took to the lower paths, where stone and root would remember his tread. The hobbits, who had at once lost and found a new wariness, were given the task of watching the gardens and the small gates by which a mouse might slip in. The stranger took the inner walk with the ranger and the old grey one, who walked as if he carried seasons behind him. They moved with the care of those who know that a single misstep unmade more than flesh. The visitor's method was not of magic but of calculation. Angles counted, shadows measured, the little noises that do not lie. He taught them to feel the valley as one feels a horse under a saddle, the toss and sway, the breathing. "Listen for what does not belong," he said in a whisper that shaped itself to the night. "Hear the pause, the wrong step, the breath that does not match the shape at hand." It was the elf who spoke first, soft and sudden as a drawn string. "There is a riding," he said. Not from the south. From afar the sound came. Hoof-beats, but weirdly muffled as if cushioned by cloud. It was not cavalry as men make it, nor the clatter of many steeds. The noise was like a single vast beast breathing, the jip of a hawk at the valley's lip, the bending of twigs under something that should not be. The stranger crouched, knives of expression in the air. "Riders that want you not to see them will wear silence like a garment," he observed. "Those that would make a voice of fear will not care if we hear them." He put a hand on the ranger's shoulder. "We will choose how they find us." They pushed toward the outermost gate where the garden walls sagged into the wood. There, beneath the boughs, where leaves still held the last warmth of a day's sun, a trace of darkness had been pressed against the earth. It was not the shadow of a man, nor the dark the moon could make, but a ring of cold in the grass, as if something hungry had lain to drink. The elf knelt and traced it with a single finger. His hand came away, rhymed with silver dew that was not dew. "Nazgûl," he whispered, and the name hung like a blade between them. It would have been easy to speak fear then, to let the old songs rise, and the memory of black riders sweep hope away. Instead, the stranger moved, as if recalling an answer already carved. He instructed the hobbits to take the little gates and the paths no grown thing would bother with. "You are small," he said. "You will be the knife that gets under the skin of a thing. Go quiet, and do not carry torches. Use the smell of earth to hide from those that smell the living." Sam looked as if his ribs might unmoor at the sound. "Mr. Frodo," he began, voice caught in his teeth, but the stranger did not let the sentence grow. Upon Frodo's face moved a determination quiet and fierce, the kind that comes from having been given both a thing to lose and a reason strong enough to hold it. The dwarf stamped. "And what of fighting?" he demanded. "We are not all thieves in the night to crawl behind hedges. We are not to fight them on their terms," the stranger replied. "Meet them with light where you must, and dark when you choose set traps and lie in wait, and above all, do not give them the scent of panic. They are bred to find fear." He drew a small, strange coil from his cloak and set it upon the stone. It made a whispering sound, not of metal, but of wind through a reed. "This will choke the night for a little while. Use it, then be gone." Gandalf, standing so that the firelight feathered his beard, looked upon the stranger with mild and fathoming eyes. His voice was a soft edict. "I learn what I can from any hand that seeks the same ends as I," he said. "No more." In the silence thereafter, the old wizard examined the coil and did not declare it sorcery. He only stored the knowledge with the quiet of a man who knows his own powers are not the only useful ones in a just cause. They moved then, small and swift and cunning as a band of wily things. The hobbit slipped through hedges. The elf became one with moonlight in the trees. The dwarf laid iron snares with his own true hands. The stranger and the ranger walked the outer terraces, listening to the valley's slow breath. It was as they had suspected. A single rider had come close to the mouth of the glen, and it had parried about the rock, seeking a way in, tasting walls for a tell. The first clash was quiet and brief. A figure like a black reed moved against the moon. Legolas' arrow sang and struck, but it found the horse and not the rider the steed reared, high and wrong, and then the creature that rode it was unseated as by a sudden gust. The thing that fell was wrapped in a cloak like a falling night. It made no sound, and yet the ground swallowed the hush as if it had been a living thing. Gimli rushed forward for the kill, axe up, but the stranger bared a single sharp hand and stopped him. "Not yet," he said. "Feel it. Do you smell it, dwarf? This is no man to be hacked and learnt from afterward. He brings news, and there is a mark in that cloak that is worth more than his life." Gimli spat. "If it is a messenger, then he will speak for his lord before he dies." Gimli's voice was fierce and blunt as a wedge, but the stranger's quick hand moved by the rider's neck, lifting the hood as if it were a curtain. Beneath it there was no face as they know a face. There was a mask dark as wet stone, and its patterns were not of men nor elves. There was a sigil upon the breast of the cloak, a ring of twisted iron circled by 7 small knives. The ranger's eyes narrowed. "East runes," he said slowly, the sound like a thorn against thought. Not Sauron, but kin to those who would trade in other people's sorrow. No one could say without answer what that sign bore. No song had taught them of its exact meaning. Yet in the hush that followed, there was a recognition among them all. The world had grown more crowded with dangers. The stranger leaned close to the fallen cloak and laid his palm upon the mark. His fingers did not tremble. "We do not yet know who wears that sigil," he said, "but we know what they intend. They test few, and all at once. If they send messengers with iron rings and hooks for names, they measure what can be taken. They measure the strength of a house, and they pick at the seam." Frodo, small and limbed by fright and resolution, spoke in a voice the valley might have mistaken for a bird. "Then we must move," he said. "We cannot be waited upon and counted like coins." The ranger looked toward the path that led away from the house and into the world of open roads. His hand fell upon the hilt of a sword, worn not for show. "There are choices," he replied, and in his eyes was the steel of a man who had loved hard and come away with the knowledge of loss. "We may draw them to us and strike from shelter, or we may go to them and find what they would take before they have ridded themselves of it." The stranger considered the path, then the seal upon the cloak. He set the coil he had shown them back into his cloak, and made the motion of a man who will not be forced into counsel. "If they test, they will return with more," he said. "I would make a drift of false paths to lead them into pits, and set a watch to study that which they do not fear. But certainty requires a step beyond observation. We must know whose hand wrote that sigil." There was a murmur among the small band, a rising of thought into plans like fish breaking the surface. The old Grey One tapped a staff upon the stone, and sparks fell like distant stars. "If you would go east," he said, "do not go openly. They are many eyes, and they look for open faces. They are no fools. Make of yourselves shadows in the road." A decision formed in the hush like a blade drawn with a single motion. The stranger looked to the ranger, then to the elf, then briefly to the hobbits who had been given a task more dangerous than any that had passed their small lives. He did not smile, but there was in his jaw a hard satisfaction. "I will go," he said, "but I will not be many. 2 blades are better than 10 in the dark. We will leave before dawn. We will ride as if to the south and turn to the east when the road is watched. There is a messenger I would meet who carries more than talk. He carries a map of alliances." No face showed relief. There was only the gathering of wills around a single point. Men and elves, a dwarf and hobbits, and one portal of a stranger who had taught them to move as one. They stood together in the night that had lately fallen like a curtain. The old clocks in the house measured out the beat of the next hours. Horses were found, cloaks were fastened, small pouches taken and secreted. Frodo felt his heart beat like a small drum. Sam put a hand upon his shoulder as if to anchor more than flesh. Outside, iron scent and old grief still clung to the air. The sign upon the cloak lay like a promise upon the stone. The stranger made one last small motion, fastening a thin coil to his boot. "If we are found," he said, voice low and certain, "we will not fight, not for the first breath. We will lead them where the land can swallow them. But if they follow a path that would take the innocent, then we will strike." They went then, with the valley at their backs and a new course bending their steps. The moonlight slid across their shoulders and tucked them into its shade. They passed through gates that had known older wars and newer songs alike. The stranger led the way, and for a moment he was only a shape between the trees, a thought that loved the night. And beyond the glen, where the road reached and spilled into the wide dark, something moved like a breath in the open. It was not yet war, nor was it peace. It was the small, dangerous thing that comes before both, a plan set in motion. A hush fell like velvet when the moon slid behind the crags, and the lamps of Imladris gathered themselves into pale, patient fires. Batman moved without ceremony, a shape among tapestries, and the fellowship pressed close to learn. He spoke seldom, and when he did, the words were like tools laid in a workman's palm, clean, precise, meant to be used and not admired. Aragorn watched him with that furrowed thoughtfulness that guarded kings and rangers alike. Legolas leaned against a pillar, eyes bright as starlit water. Gimli tapped a pick against his boot and made sound into a question. Frodo clutched the edge of his cloak. Sam watched him and did not speak, as if he feared his small voice might shatter what was being taught. "This place moves slow," Batman murmured, and the fellowship heard the assessment as both compliment and charge. "You have history, you have guardians. That is good, but when the enemy strikes, history will not keep you alive." He had stripped away the flourish of city and court in favor of hard drills. Wooden dummies stood where once scrolls had rested. Blank targets hung where songs were sung. The leather of the cloaks smelled of pine and moonfire, and each footfall made soft music on the smooth stone. The training was not mere repetition. It was a remaking. He began with sight, not the sight of archery or the sight of trackcraft, but the way light hesitates. He taught them to see the space between shadows, to notice breath on the air, to watch for disturbance in a stream when no pebbles had fallen. Legolas smiled at this, as if such things were old friends. Gimli scowled and later admitted he had never thought to read a room as if it were a mine. Frodo learned to wait in the dark and let his eyes drink the small changes. Sam learned to listen for the tremor in a spider's silk. Aragorn's hands kept moving, shaping the lesson into tactics he could wear into battle. The second lesson was movement that left no score on the world. Batman showed them how to step so that no twig remembered being broken. He showed them how to fall into silence, how to let boots kiss stone and carry secrets. The elvish steps were light as breath. The dwarf's feet were like a smith's hammer, powerful, honest, and often loud. Batman took the dwarf's hands in his gloved ones and set his feet anew. Gimli complained all evening, his voice a gruff storm, but when he walked through the hall later, even the rats held their tongues. For the hobbits, the lesson was a kind of wonder. They had always been quiet, but never calculated to disappear. Batman taught them to vanish into routine. Weapons came next. Batman refused to teach them new swords. He respected steel that had sung through 1,000 winters. Instead, he taught how to use them without playing the song the enemy expected. He taught entangling, how to make an opponent bleed time and breath rather than flesh, how to use a shield as a question rather than a wall, how to force an enemy to answer a mistake. He showed Aragorn how a parry could be a lie, and then how to make the lie true. Legolas learned a new cadence with bowstring and arrow, a pause before the release that could alter trajectories like a thought. The hobbits learned to make small cunning, ways to trip a bootlace with a bit of twine, how to set a terrace so that a pursuer would slide and cuss and lose heart. Yet the most foreign things were his tools. He set before them devices fashioned from leather and glass, simple to our tongues, miraculous to theirs. A small mirror that captured more than light, throwing back an angle where a corner hid its hand. A rope that clung like ivy to stone when thrown, and could hold a man as if the mountain itself had reached out. He did not offer crates of such wonders. He gave instead a principle: use what you have, modify what you can. He showed them how to cut a piece of elvish cord into loops that acted like stumbling snares, how to sweeten a scent with herbs so dogs would turn away. Elrond watched him from the gallery, unhurried and wary, and his quiet blessing was a deep thing the fellowship could feel. The drills stretched through several nights until the men and the small folk folded the new rules into their bones. They trained in the open court under the whispering elms, and they trained within vaults lined with books. Their practice was a kind of rehearsal for fear. Batman moved among them like a shadow that had learned to be a teacher. He expected readiness and spoke no more of mercy than a stern bell tolls time. When mistakes came, as mistakes must, he punished them with correction, not fury. He taught them to make haste a craft, not a panic. On the fourth night, a test arrived unbidden. It began with a scent, thin and wrong, as if gutters had leaked moonlight. Frodo caught it first, a metallic whisper in his nose, and he tightened his fingers around his cloak. Batman was near and turned at once. The lamplight lay like handprints on the floor, a curtain stirred without wind. Aragorn smelled it and drew his blade, not with the flourish of a lord, but with the economy of a hunter. The others spread like a thought made of muscle around him. Something had slipped inside Imladris that should not have been there. It moved like a wound on the air, a coldness not born of weather. Cameras and mechanisms were useless where elven craft now ruled fine. Batman squinted as if searching for lines normal eyes did not see. He motioned in a soundless language he had made them learn. 2 steps, halt, listen. They obeyed. The thing struck like a bee, quick and wrong. A shadow detached itself from the high rafters, and where it fell, the floor did not darken but blinked, like a star gone out. It was small and swift, dressed in gray that drank light, and it carried no sound. Gimli cursed, a single rough note, and moved to cut it off. Legolas released an arrow in the same breath. Aragorn whispered a command, not to stop it, but to herd it, to bring it into a place where they could see. The shadow was not alone for long. From the weave of the night came other shapes, not men, but slivers of intent made flesh, darting things that might have been spies or sorcery. They slid between pillars and towards the inner chamber where scrolls lay and secrets slept. Batman dropped a small rod, it hissed and spat a thin light. The rods set the air in a lattice, and the little shadows convulsed like moths against glass. One struck a lattice and rebounded with a sound like wind in a bottle. Frodo felt panic rise, hot and sudden. The hobbits had been taught to hold silence, to hide, but this was not hiding. This was a struggle to make darkness answer. He found his voice, and it was steadier than he expected. "They come for something," he whispered, and Sam answered without moving, "For Frodo or the Ways." They did not come for Frodo. They came for the hall's heart, its knowledge, the maps and letters that might tell of roots and weakness. Batman moved then with a speed that belied his dark robes. He grabbed a tapestry and tore. Behind it, the shadows spilled like spilled ink, and for a breath, the hall was a battlefield of small lights and quick, clean fighting. Aragorn punched through two of them, and did not waste a word. Legolas' arrows sang, and found places where darkness had become flesh. Gimli smashed a thing with the flat of his axe, and grinned like a smith who had found a stubborn iron. The hobbits threw small weights, and their little bodies moved like weather before a storm. But one of the shadow things did not fall. It slid under a bench and clung along the grain of the wood, a smear of malice. It carried a small case, something no tool should hold, no shape, only intent. Batman saw it and did something he had not done before in that hall. He crouched beside Frodo. "Take it," he said in a voice that suited neither dark nor dawn. "Use your instinct. You are small. Be the size of an idea." Frodo, hands trembling, reached. The shadow-scarred case hummed. It was not heavy with metal, but with purpose. For a pulse he hesitated, and then his fingers closed. The room shuddered like a throat gulping. Frodo felt a cold run up from the case into his wrist, a whisper of other paths. The shadows convulsed and pulled themselves away, as if their sting had been broken. They melted into the cracks of the hall and fled like smoke before a wind. When the quiet settled, Elrond's voice filled the vault. It was not loud, but it had weight. "What was taken?" he asked. No one answered at once. Batman's gloved hand rested near Frodo's, not touching, as if to remind the small hobbit that he had been brave, and that bravery also required counsel. Frodo opened the case. Inside lay a scrap of parchment and a pin of black glass. The parchment bore a marking that spoke of a courier's route. The black glass showed not the face of a man, but the outline of a motion, an arrow pointing east. Aragorn's face tightened. He did not speak, but his jaw worked like a man turning a forge. "They move," he said finally. "Someone takes measure of our ways." Batman watched him, and then looked out over the terraces. The moon was a knife. "They probe, and then they will test," he said. "Probes are small, tests are loud." He named nothing, as if naming the enemy would make it whole. There was an argument then of sorts, but it was not loud. Legolas urged immediate pursuit, the tilt of his chin as sure as arrow flight. Gimli favored a trap near the eastern gate. The hobbits wished only to stay where they could bake and cook and be small. Aragorn listened, and the thought in him gathered like tide at moon's call. Elrond's eyes passed from face to face like a candle inspecting glassworks. His measure was subtle but absolute. The hall would not be broken by haste, it would not be broken by fear. It would be meted and answered. Batman unrolled a plan in short gestures that spoke in angles and lines. He showed where the hall's blind spots lay, where elven sight and human cunning failed to meet. He pointed to a lane that skittered between the trees and to a ravine that hid footsteps. "You will not rush the east," he said. "You will lay a net. Aragorn, take 2 men and watch the ravine. Legolas, get elevation. Gimli, make sure the rock speaks when it is trod upon. Hobbits, you will be the lure, not the meat." His voice held the dry humor that informs dire counsel. Frodo felt the weight of the parchment in his palm, and a new understanding entered him like light through a slit. Batman's lessons had not been hardening, they had been shaping. What he asked next was not to fight, but to prepare to unmake the enemy's plan, to turn trick to trickster, to answer darkness with a map of small lights. Aragorn rose then and nodded. He did not smile. His reply was a blade's promise. The company began to arrange themselves into the roles given, and each found a quickness in the bones. Outside, the night kept its counsel. The hall's doors were bolted with more than wood now traps, and signals lay like teeth in a mouth. Batman walked to the window and watched shadow play on the distant ridges. He carried no crown, no heraldry. He had no claim in this land beyond the debt of skill traded for safe harbor. Yet he stood as if he might have always walked among these steeped and patient houses. In the glass, his shape was 2, man and silhouette. Behind him, the Fellowship tightened into formation and readied to test an enemy that had already tasted their silence. They would not leave at once. First, they would fill the night with questions, and when answers came, they would follow them like hunters. Batman turned and spoke once more, softer than before. "We will not be surprised again." Aragorn's hand closed on his hilt, and the whole hall answered in that quiet, inevitable way of warriors. The shadow had slipped inside Imladris and had taken measure. Now they would take measure of it in turn. The pursuit was near the decision to go lay like a blade on the table, and every eye touched its cold edge. The intention had been set in motion. A cold wind had come down from the mountains, and with it a hush that wrapped the court of Imladris like a hand. Lamps in the arching halls were banked low. The voices of the few who still moved in the house were careful and small. From the terrace where stone steps fell away into the valley, 2 dark shapes stood motionless beneath the lamplight, a man in a cape that drank the world's light, and a ranger whose hair hung damp with evening mist. Between them, the young hobbit breathed as if each pull of air was a thing to be earned. They had not gone to sleep as others do. The lessons that had been taught these last days lived now in limbs and throat, signals made without sound, stances that broke the arc of a sword, the way a hand closed to bite, not flesh, but the will to flee. The Dark One in the cape watched the moon, as an animal watches for the first tremor of a hunt. He spoke with the same few words he used in the training rooms, every syllable measured. "Divide," he said. 2 hold the light, 2 shadow the slopes. Keep the ring hidden. No single gaze will bear it." Aragorn's reply was a word like knotted rope. He turned his face to the valley and made the first of those silent gestures, the one that meant, "Move like water, give the enemy no edge." Legolas slipped from the outer ledge as though he, too, were a thing of shadow. Gimli stamped his foot once and grunted his own consent. Frodo felt his heartbeat like a small animal needing to be calmed. He had learned to make his breath small, to be a stone in the flow of men. The valley answered them with a sound like leather drawn across wood. It was not wind. It came from below the outer copse, from the path that wound to the old bridge. The Dark Knight's hand moved, not in command, but in a checking arc, an old soldier's habit. A faint glimmer appeared, not of blade, but of something darker than shadow, a cloak that drank starlight and left around it a colder shade. The sound that rose with it was like the edge of a bell being struck in a deep mine. Not a rider, Legolas breathed, not with fear, but with that high, swift interest that made the elven voice like the first line of a bowstring. Aragorn's hand fell to his sword. The others moved as they had been taught. 2 steps back, circle the hobbit, face the slope. The thing on the path halted, as a cat halts at the edge of a stream. There was a sliver of very pale face beneath the hood, and the eyes were like chips of ice they did not blink. A soundless flutter came from behind the thing, a small metallic whisper, and the hair on Frodo's arms rose. He had smelled iron tonight, sooner than he understood why. The cloaked figure tilted as if to speak, and for a breath the voice that came was neither wholly living nor entirely spirit. "I seek what you carry," it said. The vowels were wrong, shaped on the edge of a hole. The dark night's presence folded in on itself. He stepped forward 1 pace, a shadow within shadow. He did not speak as an elven lord might. His voice was low, edged with that city hunger. "You will not take him, not while I stand." The cloak beside him moved, and Bruenor's, Gimli's, axe was a promise on a saddle of leather. Aragorn's face became the weather. The thing smiled without mirth and raised an arm. The gesture uncoiled like a rope. From its palm slid a blade, black as drowned pitch, and notched with runes that drank the light. When it moved, the very air, bluish near it, burned faint, and left the world smelling of old rain and the memory of iron. Batman did not wait. 2 small shapes left his belt, small discs of folded metal and glass, unfamiliar in the old tongue, and he cast them not like weapons, but like seeds. They struck the stone with a sound like glass, singing smoke unreeled, thick and fragrant with herbs. The world blurred. Legolas' arrow sang. Gimli surged, a wedge of raw force, and the ranger leapt through the falling haze as if born to that motion. The cloaked figure stepped sideways and was not alone. Behind it, under the thin silver of the valley, other shapes flowed from the trees. Pale figures, not quite men, not quite shadow. Assassins, perhaps, trained in dread things, each with a little lamp that drank light. They broke like a net across the slope. This was no random prowler. The Dark Knight's brow tightened. He had taught them to meet blades, he had not taught elves to fight ghosts. Yet the students did what the teacher had made possible. Aragorn did not charge, but bent the fight into a doorway. He took the first strike and gave it, not to meet, but to guide, to send the enemy's force around a pivot. Legolas' arrows found axe holes in the shadow suits. Gimli hurled himself into the press, and with every step he sang his oath, a harsh thing in a night that asked for low songs. Frodo stood small within their circle and thought of all that had been said about fear. He thought of the weight at his throat, and made it lighter by calling every name he could. The shadows retreated and came again. The cloaked leader moved as if dancing, and the air around its blade left a thin frost on the stone. Aragorn's hand smacked down against the hilts of his sword, and he felt, for the first time in a long time, a blade against a force it did not know. He ground his teeth and remembered the training that had nothing to do with steel. The watching, the waiting, the trick of seeing the first twitch in an enemy's shoulder that told you where the true weakness lay. Batman's devices made the night worse for those who strode in it. He had taken the tools of a stranger land and made them into disturbances, flashes of sound that confused the mind, mirrors that threw back shapes, traps that unspooled nets of rope that smelled like tar and sting. "Northern hold," he called once, in that flat tone that did not ask favors. "Sweep the copse, close the river path." The words were his arrow, and men moved. Even so, one of the pale figures slipped through. It came like a thought, light and quick, and from its brow dangled a tiny charm. Frodo felt its presence as one feels a needle in cloth. The thing struck for the ring not with iron, but with sudden intent, an attempt to touch, to peer, to name. Frodo's fingers closed as a reflex taught by nights of hiding and of the sound of boots on steps. The blade of cold did not bite the flesh, it sought the mind. Frodo heard a whisper like the rustle of dead leaves, a voice asking him to remember something he had not yet lived. The ring trembled. Then Batman stepped between the thing and the hobbit, a silhouette that was a promise and a wall. He did not strike to kill. He did not have men of killing in his new home. He struck a blow precise enough to break a wrist and nothing more. The cloaked leader staggered as if hit by a winter sun. It spat words that curdled into steam and took to flight like black moths. The smaller shadows followed. They did not flee. They withdrew in the slow, patient way of men who plan to be back. When at last the night cleared, the air tasted of smoke and iron and the crispness left by a fight. One of the little lamps lay broken, a scrap of the attacker's cloak, stuck to an elm branch, black and damp. There was a symbol upon it, pressed in silver thread, a circle broken by a thin line, and within the circle a tiny star. Aragorn stooped and touched it as if to see whether it was warm. It was cold as the valley stone. Elrond came from his hall then, his step quiet as a bird's, and his eyes were deeper than the weather. He looked at the broken things and saw more than torn cloth. He turned to the dark night and said, in a voice like a bell struck in water, "This is no common band. They are sent by one who shapes fear to a new craft. They seek not only the ring, but the knowledge of those who move between shadows and steel." Batman's reply was a simple mapping of consequence. They test, they probe. They will come again stronger and with crafts to match ours. We should not meet them in the courtyard where the river runs, there you have no advantage. We lead them to the gate of the House of Songs. There are things beneath the paving we laid last autumn. The hobbits will be brought to safety. 2 pairs of eyes go with the tracker. Elrond did not argue. He bowed his head not in deference, but in weary calculation. "Make ready, then," he said, "for if they return with fire to melt the river, this valley will pay a dear price." His gaze lingered on Frodo with the kind of sadness a tree wears when it watches the forest burn. "And the ring will be carried where I command," Batman answered, "not where fear bids it go." They moved as a tide. The hobbit was led away with a cloak over his head, like a small stone wrapped against a storm. Gimli kept muttering, half to himself and half to his axe, about the ugliness of foes that were neither man nor shadow. Legolas walked at the edge, listening to the night as if it were a page in a book. Aragorn and Batman fell into a step, like 2 hands that have long clasped in battle, each knowing the other's weight. Yet as they went, the ranger who had stood on the terrace did not wipe the circle from his hand. He carried the broken charm and held it high beneath the moon. The small star within the ring had a thread that led not to Dol Guldur alone, but to another rumor, half remembered by traders who passed the covert roads. A smith not of Sauron's direct making, but a maker of edged cunning, a pale apprentice whose hands were as clever as his master's were cruel. The ranger's voice held iron beneath his sorrow when he named the thing. "The Pale Engineer," he said. "He was spoken of in whispers in the south. If he is here, then Sauron learns to bend craft to shadow." The name slid through the night like frost. Batman's face, always a mask, shifted a little for the first time. The slope of his mouth showed something like worry. Elrond closed his eyes and counted the cost in things that could not speak back. "Then we must move before the smith finds a way to make Nighthold iron," he said. They had a plan now, but plans are brittle when faced with a maker who can work in the seam between worlds. They made the House of Songs ready. They unrolled old songs into traps and old lights into snares. Batman walked the stones and set devices that would not bewitch as men do, but would confuse the eye and mark the step. Aragorn carved the timing into the bodies of his men, when to hold, when to strike, how to turn defeat into doorway. Legolas and Gimli argued over the merits of noise and silence, and each convinced the other of the need for both. When the last lamp was banked and the hobbits were put under Elrond's care, they stood on the terrace and looked out into the valley. The moon had thinned to a sliver, and in its wake lay a long, pale road that led east. Frost began to lace the grass. The broken charm lay in Aragorn's palm like a small accusation. The decision that faced them was simple as a bone and terrible as a storm. Pursue the trail now and risk drawing a true storm to their haven, or wait, knit their lines tighter, and let the smith fashion his weapon. Batman's hand closed on the slate of the valley. "If he crafts his tools another night hence," he said, "his weapons will be birthed in strength we cannot yet measure. I would see his forge before it is set. Knowledge taken early is a victory in itself." Elrond's eyes were old as a mountain. He weighed the cost of a single life against the shelter of many. At last he nodded, the movement like a falling leaf. "Then go," he said, "but take with you not only shadow and steel, but song and speech. For minds may be changed, and arms may be broken. The hardest thing to mend is the voice." The plan formed there on the rim of the court. A hunter's sweep into the deep valley where the trees grew close and the river curved like a hidden thing. They would not go as one great force. They would break like rivers, find the smith's current, and force it to spill its course. To do that, they needed to follow the pale trail without shouting it to the hills. To do that, they needed the man who could teach the fellowship to move as one blade. Batman, who had come to the ancient house bearing the weight of another world, folded his cape about him and adjusted the little devices at his belt. There was no boast in the way he set his shoulders. The night held its breath. The valley folded its hands. Aragorn slotted the broken charm into a pocket and fastened his cloak. Legolas drew an arrow and tested the string as if tasting the wind. Gimli checked his axe grip and grinned in the way of dwarves who lived to meet danger. Frodo, small and quieter than all, felt the old ring in its hidden place like a seed that waits for the season. He steadied his breathing and drew a single ragged line across his palm to show himself he was still there. They stepped off together into the shadow of the trees, moving like a thought made flesh, and behind them the house of Imladris shut its doors. They had learned much to fight. What they had known, they were not yet prepared for what might be wrought by a smith who could make the night into a weapon. The valley hummed with that knowledge. Their feet sank into the path, and the world narrowed to the sound of leather and the faint scrape of weapons in sheaths. Each step was a promise. Each promise was a challenge. They were going after a maker who sought to unmake them, and beyond the first turn in the track lay a forge none of them could yet imagine. Moonlight lay on Imladris, like a cool blade, sliding down eaves and pooling in the courtyards. Stone drank the light and held its hush. From the galleries came the soft, sure tread of those who kept watch. Their breaths made little clouds in the chill. A dark shape moved along the far wall, not through the gate, but upon the air itself, a thing that breathed out winter and took in sound. Men and elves alike felt an old, slow prickling across the skin, an answering of memory more than a pain, and they looked to the roofs. He stood against that cold with no more than a silhouette. The stranger's cloak had been traded for a different black, for garments stitched to shadow and silence. He carried no sword, his hands were leather and cunning. When he raised a finger, the fellowship around him tightened into the formation he had taught them, wedges and arcs, a crescent that could bite or break. Aragorn's eyes found him and held, a captain recognizing another kind of command. The stranger inclined his head once, a curt, foreign salute, and the plan moved like a living thing among the people of Imladris. There came at last the sound they feared, the soft, ailing keening of the Nazgûl as it passed the outer tree line. The sound did not carry like a wind, it gathered like smoke. The ring-bearer's breath hitched where he crouched, fingers on cold grass. The creature did not run, it hunted with the patience of night itself. Legolas' hand found string and bow, Gimli's axe lay ready on his knee, beetle brow furrowed. The stranger made a small, quick motion, and two hobbits slid into the shadow of a low wall, quiet as stone. They had been trained to wait, to make no story with their feet. In training, their feet had learned the hush of hunted things, the soft footfall of owls, the human mimicry of falling leaves. Now the lesson flowered. The Nazgûl circled, tasting the air. It did not look with eyes it sought, with a need that reached into the marrow. Frodo could feel the compulsion as one might feel the sun's heat through a pane, present, driving. The man in black moved like a thought and planted 3 devices against the parapet. They were not elvish nor wholly mortal in craft. They were strange contrivances lined with powder and glass, and when he struck them the sound was not of a bell, but of the snap of a twig. There is a sound that will make the dead start and the living turn. It is a sound of something denied its prey. It is the sound of a net closing. The stranger's devices let out a whispering hiss, and then a flare, low, wide, like the breath of a forge laid flat. It did not burn like flame, it burned like memory of dawn. The Nazgûl recoiled as one loses balance, as one hears a name spoken that was meant never to be spoken. For a heartbeat, the shadow of the thing shuddered, and behind that misgiving came the gilded light of Elrond's watches, thrown like a web across the courtyard. Gandalf's hand, if Gandalf's hand was there, might have lifted a staff, but magic moves in many tongues. The stranger's contrivances had been made to speak to shadows, and he spoke with them. He did not challenge the wraith with steel. He challenged it with absence. Gaps where the wraith expected flesh and fear, mirrors for its need. Aragorn felt the old stirring of dread, the ancestral call that a ranger knows in the marrow, and yet he obeyed the rhythm the stranger set. The fellowship curved and folded. A dozen blades showed and were hidden again. The hobbits lay still as pebbles beneath rushing water. The first clash came at the broken arch. 2 riders, if they could be called riders, fell like night-born sails across the stones, and where their robes brushed the moss, the plants turned toward rot. Legolas' arrow sang and struck like a song, but the thing that received it drank the sound and did not cry. Gimli leapt and struck with an axe like thunder. The wedge of wood met fabric and leached nothing but a sullen sound. Yet, even as steel failed, the training did not. They did not try to smite what they could not wound. They set about other tasks. They cut lines. They swept away the watchers who prowled. They sealed doors and lit small beacons of living fire to confuse the wraith's sense. From the shadows of the trees, a thing came that had not been taught in any school of war: cunning. The stranger moved like a predator, and when he reached the foot of the arch, he put down something that smelled faintly of iron and of pine. It was a coil, a rope, braided with a voice. He gave one end to Aragorn. "When it leans," he said briefly, and the two words carried a compass. Aragorn took the rope as one takes a sword, with decision. He would not wear another man's mastery, but he would use the means given him. The Nazgûl leaned upon the night again, drawn by hunger and the faint scent of a hobbit's heartbeat. The trap was simple, archaic in its cunning. They baited with silence and light, and the stubborn thing of Frodo's presence. Where the Nazgûl desired the ring, the Fellowship offered an echo of presence instead. A cloak on a stone, a little boot left half-laced, a scent of stew left on a platter. The wraith tested them with whispers that crawled under ribs, asking histories and threatening names. The stranger stood at the center of the web and watched how the web answered. When the Nazgûl sprang, it found itself bound, not with iron that would bruise flesh, but with schemes that folded the air and made it stumble like a blind thing. No battle is without cost, and the cost that night took was not blood in the open. It took breath. It took the small, stubborn lights of those who stood guard. Elvish torches guttered and flared as though a great wing passed over them. A scout's cloak smoked with frost where the Nazgûl's shadow passed. He coughed and spat, but he did not fall. The stranger moved among them like a conductor, each twitch of his hand giving the beat. There was a moment when the wraith's mask turned toward him, and though it could not touch him, it gazed as one. Mind gazes upon another. For an instant there was recognition, and within it a cold amusement, as if the long-sundered things of the world found an old riddle. "Your tricks will not hold," it said, "not in words, but in a pull upon memory." Frodo felt the ring tug hard, certain that some vast force had found their scent. He pressed his hand to his own breast, to the soft weight at his chain. The man in black moved closer, not nearer in distance, but nearer in purpose. He set his hand upon Frodo's shoulder. A human gesture, so small in that place, and it steadied him. The hobbit's breath became less like a stolen thing and more like a thing reclaimed. From training had come courage, from touch had come steadiness. Then the wraith unleashed its most cunning terror. It unmade light. The beacons that burned, the watchfires that kept the sky from swallowing men whole, trembled as if a great breath passed through the world. Shadows lengthened, merging forms that had been known suddenly looked strange to their owners. Some among them lost their footing. Some heard voices of home that were not home. In that sundered hour, Aragorn shouted, clear and true, and his voice braided the broken things together. "Hold!" he cried, and the word flew like a spear. Men answered with steel and with the silent motions the stranger had taught them. Elves answered with arrows notched like falling stars. The man in black did what his kind does best. He used fear as a map. He sent the Fellowship out in feints and doubles, half-routes, that hid the true way. Frodo, small and tethered by courage, was moved like a river stone along channels made by others. The wraith pursued where there was light, and found only shadow it sought where there was sound, and heard only echo. Slowly, as all things that are patient do, it grew frustrated. It did not want a fight of blades. It wanted a yielding. It wanted the rung on which a name might slip. In the end, the night yielded not to a single blow, but to 1,000 refusals. A flash of contrived light and a bowl of smoke, a thrown net that caught air and not man. A hobbit's sob turned into a laugh as he stubbed his toe on a hiding place, and the wraith looked away. These were the small triumphs. The Nazgûl, thwarted again and again by means it could not reckon, recoiled. It circled once more upon the hills, and in that circling the stranger made his final move. He did not chase, he did not call it back. He wound his devices together, and with a steady hand he unmade a little of the night, and in that unmaking there was a light that did not burn, but banished the pall, as morning banishes a dream. The wraith lifted and fled, a black sail into broader dark. It sought the road, seeking patience in the world. Behind it 1,000 small breaths came back into the throats of men and elves. The courtyard lay scathed, but upright banners hung limp but not broken. Frodo sat upon cold stone and let the stranger's hand find his again, anchoring him to the ground. Aragorn's face was wet with something like rain and praise. Legolas drew his bow down and smiled wanly. Gimli grinned in that way of his that meant both exhaustion and triumph. The stranger removed his cowl for a moment and revealed a face mapped by intent and long wakefulness. His eyes were like iron, and like midnight both they had seen a world beyond this, and yet here they rested. "You have taught us much," Aragorn said, voice hoarse and certain. "But what will you do next?" It was a question both of thanks and of warning. The presence at their threshold had been driven back, but the shadow that cast it was not ended. The stranger's mouth twitched in what might have been the corner of a smile. "We will not wait for the next night," he said. "You have learned to stand. Now you must learn to move." He gestured toward the saddle courts and the eastern gate where the road opened toward moonless lands. The fellowship rose as one, armor clinking like the promise of rain. The hobbits looked at one another, at the little ring that now lay like a dull star beneath a cloak, and then ahead where the path turned into the wide, waiting dark. Aragorn folded the rope the stranger had given him and slung it over a shoulder. Legolas flexed his fingers. Gimli spat, tasted the air, and nodded. They would not remain in halls of song while shadows learned their names. To leave was to risk, to step into the world unmade and make it whole again. The stranger gathered his things, the contrivances that had whispered and burned and taught, and he slipped the cowl back over his head. No man asked where he had come from. No man asked what lay under his banner. They had been given a method, a way to bend darkness with cunning and craft. That was enough. As the company filed toward the gate, the moon slid behind a cloud and the night widened like a held breath. The road before them was not marked by certainty but by purpose, and in each stride there was the new music of those who had learned to move when stillness would have been death. Behind them the halls of Imladris watched and listened and perhaps hoped. Ahead there was the long, uncertain world, and the stranger in black walked with them, a shadow among shadows, and yet not wholly of them. They passed beneath the arch, and the echo of their footsteps set the road to answer.